This old church looks as though it's in the middle of nowhere, and most of us think we know why. We believe the village must have disappeared or moved away, but in this and most other examples there's a problem with that theory. There's little or no evidence that a village ever stood here. So why build a church here, in the middle of nowhere? Today we're going to use Thundridge Old Church in Hertfordshire to help explain a much bigger mystery, because what happened here to this old church happened all over Britain. So strangely enough, the explanation begins, at least in part, on this nearby hill, Wadesmill. I'm halfway up Wadesmill Hill. It's hardly the steepest hill in the UK or in Hertfordshire, but at 10% it's still pretty steep. Can you imagine trying to climb this hill carrying heavy produce, and the surface is muddy and slippery? Maybe you're driving livestock, or maybe you're trying to get little children to follow along behind you. So for centuries, travellers from London heading north faced a simple choice: either use this steep hill or follow this gentle route through the valley. Before modern roads, hills really mattered. Today we measure journeys in miles, but back then they measured journeys in effort. People weren't necessarily drawn here because the church was here, but the church was placed here because people were already passing through this very busy valley. This remarkable, if not strange map was produced at about 1400. It gives us an idea of how medieval people viewed England. It's known as the Goth map, and it's Britain's oldest surviving road map. Thundridge itself isn't named on it, but the route passing through it is. It reminds us that medieval England wasn't a collection of isolated villages, but a network of well-used roads and tracks. Long before Christianity arrived, people were already drawn to this valley. Nearby are Bronze Age barrows, Roman remains and ancient springs. This landscape was important long before anyone built a church here, because important places often remain important places, even when the people and their beliefs change. In 1086, the manor of Thundridge appears in the Domesday Book. The survey records 4 villagers, 3 smallholders and, perhaps surprisingly to us today, 2 slaves. But the Domesday Book was not a census of everyone who lived here. It was primarily a record of land, wealth and the resources that made the manor work, and to collect tax. At this time in history, we should think of the old church as a manorial church. In other words, a church closely associated with the local manor and the people who lived and worked on its estate. A church serving the lord of the manor, his tenants, labourers, servants and their families. A church connected to one of the most important economic centres in the area. The church may not have been in the middle of a village, but it stood at the heart of a working landscape. Then came the Black Death, the greatest catastrophe medieval England had ever experienced. Labour became scarce, farming changed, land use evolved, communities adapted. But something fascinating happened here. The church survived. In fact, much of the remaining tower we see today was built or substantially improved after the plague left. Which tells us something important. It tells us this site was significant, still wealthy enough and important enough to invest in. Then came another great turning point. Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. Pilgrimage declined, religious life was transformed. Places like Thundridge did not suddenly become irrelevant, but their role was changed, just as it had changed before, and just as it would change again. This is the part most of us miss. Churches don't become isolated overnight. Instead, the world around them slowly moves away, gradually evolving. Population shifts, land ownership changes, economic priorities alter. The centre of gravity gradually moves elsewhere, until one day we look at an ancient church and wonder why it was built in such a strange place. During the 18th century, Ware became the premier malting town in England. Every sack of barley and every barrel of ale had to move through the landscape somehow. While very unpopular, travellers paid a toll towards maintaining and improving the highway. Over the centuries, roads became better engineered and more reliable. Traffic was increasingly concentrated on the main route over Wadesmill Hill. The old church did not move, but the focus of movement throughout the landscape gradually did. What was once part of a busy working landscape began to feel increasingly remote. In 1853, in the neighbouring village of Thundridge, a new church was built overlooking the village. The focus of worship moved to the west. This old church slowly fell into ruin, and only then did the illusion take hold, the illusion that it had somehow been built in the middle of nowhere. So the biggest mistake we make is believing that this church was ever isolated. The roads altered, the economy adapted, the way people worshipped evolved, and the landscape was reshaped. But the church stayed where it had always been, and once you realise that, you see ancient churches very differently. What feels like the middle of nowhere today was probably once the centre of somewhere. Do you know of an isolated church or building? Drop a comment below.